Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ102 Introduction to Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, tonight's lecture is going to cover Chapter 12, where we're going to take a look at community sentences, probation, a term called intermediate sanctions, and another term, and kind of a new concept called restorative justice. So we're really going to kind of look at the concept of probation. We'll look at some criminal justice issues, some issues related to technology, um, and some other alternatives to imprisonment, etc. So that's kind of where we're going to go for tonight's lecture. So a lot to cover. Let's go ahead and just jump right in. So what do we hope to get out of this chapter? Well, we're going to discuss the history of what they call community sentences, characterize the different types of probation sentences, summarize the rules of probation, and we'll look at the difference between probation and parole, discuss the organization and administration of probation services, define and discuss the term risk classification, interpret some of the legal issues relating to probation, discuss the effectiveness, meaning does it really work, explain what is meant by intermediate sanctions, and then finally explain the concept of restorative justice and discuss its merits and really kind of take a quick peek as to whether it works or not. So again, a lot to cover. Okay, so probation versus parole. Now, I know the chapter starts off with the concept of probation, but a lot of times we just don't know the difference between these two things. So I thought that maybe starting off here would be a good idea. So people often confuse the terms probation and parole. Probation is part of the sentencing that a person receives when they're convicted. And this probation is imposed by the judge, and it either reduces or eliminates the time that a defendant must spend in custody. Now, depending on these circumstances, either the court or a probation officer monitors the defendant's compliance with his or her probation terms. And we'll talk about probation terms in just a minute. And then I put these two side by side so you can see both arrest, both conviction, probation, prison. So you can see parole, you do prison time and then you're out on parole and you're done. Here, your conviction, you get probation, so you don't get this, and then your sentence is complete. So there's a little bit of difference in there, right? So parole is also a supervised program, but it applies only in felony cases where a person is sent to, let's say, a California state prison, and it doesn't take effect until after the person's release from prison. So once paroled, that particular inmate agrees to abide by certain terms or conditions. And when an inmate is paroled, depends on his or her sentence. So again, you can see these side by side, and an easy way to remember it is parole, you're going to do time in state prison. Probation basically takes you're convicted, but instead of doing state prison time, you're put on this probationary contract, if you will, with certain terms. So you're not going to prison in lieu of the probation. So hopefully that kind of, maybe that helps. I hope it does. Okay, so, community sentencing, just to kind of start off with, including probation. So probation is part of this community sentencing concept, is the most common form of correctional treatment because it makes no sense to lock up a non-dangerous, repentant offender in an overcrowded and dangerous correctional system, which can damage them a little bit further, of course, and kind of help them or lock them into a life of crime. And you have to think about that because when people do go to prison, they're surrounded by other prisoners, right? Which typically are convicted individuals, especially in prison, as convicted felons. So it's not the best environment for you to do well and thrive. Hopefully that kind of makes sense, right? And here's another little chart that talks about probation. Okay, so it may be more effective and less costly to have them remain in the community under supervision of a kind of a trained court officer or a probation officer, where they can receive treatment that will help them turn their lives around, hopefully. And rehabilitation would be aided immensely if those who, commit crime could be made to understand the problems their action caused their family, friends, and community. And there are some other reasons that probation is, or community sentences are popular. So, one reason that a community sentence is popular would be because they're less costly than a jail sentence or a prison sentence. Next, they help the offender maintain family and community ties. So they're not in prison, they're out, right? So that kind of helps with that community tie. They can be structured to maximize security and maintain public safety to a certain degree. They can be scaled in severity to correspond to the seriousness of the crime to a certain degree. And they can feature restoration and reintegration, meaning how do we reintegrate somebody back into society, etc. And a lot of times they kind of act as a second chance that can, enable an individual to resume a more productive lifestyle, if you will. So again, these are some other reasons for the attractiveness, if you will, of community sentences. And we know probation really is one of the oldest ones and typically one of the more popular ones. So by definition then, what is probation? So probation is a criminal sentence that suspends or delays a correctional term in prison or jail, right? They're not going there. They're going to suspend that in return for community supervision, during which the probationer must abide by certain conditions that are set forth by the court under the supervision of a probation officer. And here I pulled out a Kern County terms and conditions of probation. And it might be hard to see, but you can see here, number one, you are to report by written form on a monthly basis. Number two, you are to obey all laws, orders of the court, terms of probations, directives of and you can see they go all the way down. And some of them are that you're not supposed to hang out with gang members. Some might be that you're not supposed to drink alcohol or do drugs. So all these conditions are different. So again, it's a sentence basically that entails the conditional release of a convicted person, because you are convicted, back into the community under supervision of the court in the form of a probation officer. So you're not going to prison. You're going to get this probation thing instead. And I actually pulled up a slide of what it looks like. So if you were to run somebody's information and you can see that they're on probation, here are some of this person's things that he has to obey, right? Obey all laws and orders of the court. Do not own, use, possess, buy, sell dangerous or deadly weapons, blah, 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 okay? And you can see here, do not annoy, harass, molest anyone involved in this case. Do not threaten anyone. Do not force. So these are all terms and conditions, okay? So hopefully it kind of, and then you might even have restitution, meaning they have to pay a fine or something like that. So again, there are rules when you get out. All right. So as we start to talk a little bit more, let's learn a couple of new terms. But right before we get there, let me kind of just throw this out. The philosophy of probation today rests on the assumption that the typical offender is not a dangerous criminal or what they call a menace to society, but someone who basically has made a mistake and has the ability and potential to reform. And when such offenders are institutionalized instead of being granted, some type of community release, the prison community becomes their new reference point, right? They're forced to interact with, more hardened criminals, if you will, and they develop that ex-con label that basically kind of interferes with a successful readjustment into society. And all conditions that, both impede uh, their successful rehabilitation and increase the likelihood of recidivism. So again, sending, if you have a nonviolent offender, probation really is a good thing in a sense that it kind of keeps them on track and hopefully they can learn from their mistake instead of placing them in an environment where everybody around them is kind of a hardened criminal, if you will. All right, so where did this come from? All right, and talk a little bit about where did the idea of probation come from. So the roots of probation can be traced back to the tradition of English common law. And during the Middle Ages, judges who wished to basically spare deserving offenders from, commonly used punishments like torture, mutilation, and even death, used their power to grant clemency and stays of execution. And the common law practice of what they call judicial reprieve allowed judges to suspend punishments so that convicted offenders could seek a pardon, gather new evidence, or demonstrate that they had basically changed or reformed their behavior. Okay? Now, similarly, the practice of what they call recognizance enabled convicted offenders to remain free if they agreed to enter into basically a debt obligation with the state. And the debt would have to be paid only if the offender was caught engaging in further criminal behavior or activity. So, I mean, this is kind of where the concept of probation started to evolve when we talk about judicial reprieve, and then we talk about this term called recognizance. So, a little bit more, John Augustus is basically considered the father of probation. And early U.S. courts continued the practice of basically indefinitely suspending sentences of criminals who seemed deserving of a second chance. But it really was John Augustus, who resided in Boston at that time, who is credited with basically originating the modern probation concept, if you will. And probation is the oldest correctional-based program, and as you could probably guess, the most common alternative to a jail or a prison sentence. So again, by definition, probation, a sentence entailing the conditional release of a convicted, remember they have to be convicted, offender into the community under the supervision of the court, subject to certain conditions for a specified amount of time. And then as things kind of evolve from back when, John Augustus was, where he began to deal with probation and things like that way back in like 1841, this concept continued on and soon became, again, the most widely used correctional mechanism in the United States. So how many people are on probation? When we talk about, contemporary probation services. So considering its benefits, again, it's not surprising that probation, the population of probationers has undergone continual growth, right? And about 4 million people are currently on probation. 4.7 million on all forms of community supervision. And that entails other things that we'll talk about. Now, more than 2 million people are being placed on probation annually, a slightly larger number than those exiting their probation sentence. And again, probation rules are a set of conditions or restrictions mandated by the court that must be obeyed by that probationer. So, when you kind of look at it here, without probation, the correctional system could, and more than likely would, rapidly become even more overcrowded, more overly expensive, and even more unmanageable, right? Because you're not letting anybody out. You're just pouring all of the people in. And here's a little bit when you go to the Prison Policy Initiative, the link's underneath it, and you can basically see how many folks are on probation or on parole, etc. And there's some really good data at that website as well. And here you can also look at probation. You can see how it's gone up over the years because again, we know that it's more widely used. You can see prison and jail sentences and then parole. So again, a great website for you to go to. All right, so let's talk now a little bit more about those conditions of probation. So most probation orders involve a contract between the court and the offender in which a prison or jail term is suspended. And the probationer, again, promises to obey a set of basically probation rules or conditions that are mandated by the court. And if the rules are violated, meaning that they violate one of the rules that you can see here, and typically there could be even more than 16 that you see here. But if those rules are violated, and they call this a technical violation, or if the probationer commits a subsequent criminal offense, a legal violation, like a crime, right? Then probation could be revoked. And by definition, revocation basically means that the community sentence is terminated and the original sentence of incarceration is then enforced. So another definition that you'll find in your book, it's a judicial order by a court removing a person from parole or probation in response to a violation on part of the parolee or the probationer. And then the sentence is actually carried out. So you could end up doing some prison time should you violate your probation. So if an offender on probation commits a second offense that is more serious than the first, that person may also be indicted, tried, and sentenced on the second offense. Okay? So, a lot of different things to consider here. Probation is a really good thing. I totally believe in it. The court systems would be clogged without it. But it does come with, the fact that people need to be monitored, making sure that they're following, their probation guidelines, etc. Now, as I kind of said, and we're still under the guise, if you will, talking about revocation. Some conditions, such as, they have this one condition that basically says that you can't leave a certain jurisdiction. Those are standard and are applied in every probation case. But the sentencing judge usually has broad discretion to set specific conditions on a case-by-case basis. And that kind of makes sense, right? Sometimes an individual, probationer is given specific rules related to his or her particular circumstances, such as a requirement to obtain counseling or, let's say, attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. And now these conditions, they can't be cruel conditions, of course. That kind of makes sense, such as requiring an offender to make restitution out of proportion to the seriousness of the criminal act. But judges may, however, legally impose restrictions that are tailored to the criminal act. So if it's a gang shooting, they can't possess weapons, they can't be involved in alcohol or drugs, they can't hang out with other known gang members, maybe they can't hang out in a certain area. So they can tailor a lot of these, and it really is meant for, community safety as well. So again, just kind of a rehash, probation may be revoked if that individual fails to comply with the rules and disobeys reasonable requests to meet their treatment obligation. And this means that the community sentence then for probation is terminated. Okay. Some states have a statewide probation service, but each court jurisdiction controls its local department. Other states maintain a strong statewide authority with centralized control and administration. So, sometimes it's different from place to place, but you can see some of the differences here. And just kind of finishing up, when we talk about revocation, one thing that really has kind of come to light would be the conditions of probation as it relates to the internet age. So because personal computers and the internet are commonplace, probation orders now account for social media or internet use, including chat rooms, visits to adult entertainment sites, and the purchasing of drugs via the web. A lot of times, anyone that's involved with any type of sex offense will be prohibited from going online to certain chat rooms, etc., right? Because they don't want the person to reoffend. So, yeah, so they monitor the sites that they go to. And here, when they talk about drugs and things like that, so if you had some type of drug offense and you were on probation, you probably wouldn't be wanting to go to this website, which is called Weed Maps, which basically shows you where certain places are where you can buy different types of marijuana, if you will, at different strengths, and who delivers what, etc. So this would be one of those sites that perhaps would be monitored that you could not visit without maybe receiving some type of technical violation or something like that. All right, so how do we award probation, or how is probation awarded then? So probationary sentences may be granted by state and federal district courts and state superior courts or felony courts, right? Probation is not restricted to petty or first-time criminals. Most people convicted of felonies do receive some type of incarceration, either in prison or jail, but about 30% of felons are sentenced to probation. And more than half of all cases involve a direct sentence to probation without a prison term being suspended or delayed. So, again, you could probably see why or how it's used often and why it's the most widely used type of community sentence, which kind of makes sense. Now, in some states, juries may recommend probation if the case meets certain legally, regulated criteria, or if it falls within a certain class of offense as determined by the statute. Even in jurisdictions that allow juries to recommend probation, however, judges always have the final say in the matter and may grant probation at their discretion. Now, typically, it's going to be the judge in most states, but in some states, the juries can actually do that. So it really depends on what state. So with that said, in about 20% of sentences, judges formulate a prison sentence and then suspend it if the offender agrees to obey the rules of probation while living in the community. And, some of the typical sentences that we could kind of look at here would be 35 months for a violent offense, 32 months for property offenses, and 31 months for drug crimes. So these are just some typical probationary sentences. And a little bit more on that, the United States has approximately 2,000 adult probation agencies, and more, again, as I said before, more than half are associated with a state level agency. In the rest of the states, probation is primarily a local responsibility. Probation departments in these jurisdictions are housed within local courts and controlled by judicial authorities. And about 30 states combine probation and parole supervision into a single agency. So that's kind of how the agencies are basically broke down. All right, so just kind of a couple other facts as it relates to awarding probation. The definition, suspended sentence. This is a prison term that is delayed while the defendant undergoes a period of community treatment. And if the treatment is successful, then the prison term is terminated. So it might be that you have to finish this drug rehab program, and when you've completed that, you can go back to court, and that will show that you've basically completed your sentence. So that's the definition of what they call a suspended sentence. All right, so a little bit on probation services. So I talked about this just a moment ago, but it doesn't hurt to kind of go over it again. The United States has approximately 2,000 adult probation agencies. More than half are associated with state-level agencies. And in the rest of the states, probation is primarily a local responsibility. So you might have like San Bernardino County probation, Riverside County probation, right? That kind of makes sense. So usually it's a county thing. And these probation departments in these jurisdictions are housed within the local courts and controlled by judicial authorities. And as I said a moment ago, about 30 states combine probation and parole supervision into one single agency. But regardless of the kind of the administrative setup, if you will, probation department staff usually engage in certain activities. So they supervise or monitor cases to ensure that the rules are being followed. They create effective treatment plans. They conduct sentencing investigations to help the judges formulate a proper and effective sentence. And in some cases, they conduct basically what they call an intake hearing, in which victims, complainants, and defendants are contacted and interviewed in order to determine whether criminal charges should be filed or whether cases can be handled kind of informally. So you can see there's a lot to it, right? And this is, I just kind of went over that, so we'll kind of got a little bit ahead of myself. All right, so what are some tasks, some duties of probation officers? Well, staff officers in probation departments are usually charged with 5 primary tasks: be investigation, intake, what they call diagnosis, treatment and supervision, and risk classification. So what we'll do now is we'll just take a quick look at each one so you have a better understanding. So let's talk about investigation first. So in the investigative stage, the supervising probation officer accumulated important information on the background and activities of the offender being considered for probation, because remember, they're going to do this report. And this, what they call the pre-sentence investigation report, serves as the basis for sentencing and controls whether the convicted defendant will be granted community release or basically, sentenced to some type of secure confinement. Now, at the conclusion of most investigations, a recommendation is made to the presiding judge that reflects the department's sentencing posture. Now, the judge can pretty much rule whichever way they want to, but this makes it basically fair where the probation officer completes this background on this individual, does this pre-sentence investigative report, submits that to the judge so the judge can make a better decision on whether this person would be good, fit into probation or, some type of early release or community release program. And it kind of helps the judge make a decision. All right, and then there's intake. So probation officers who conduct intake interviews may be looking to settle the case without the necessity of a court hearing. And here, the probation officer works with all parties involved, in the case, the offender, the victim, law enforcement, and so on, to basically come up with an equitable resolution to the issue. So maybe they won't have to have a hearing or sentencing. They can kind of handle it at a lower level. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Diagnosis, this is used to select the appropriate treatment modes. So in order to select the appropriate treatment modes, probation officers, using their training in counseling, social work, psychology, etc., analyze the probationer's character, attitude, and behavior. And many have personal and social problems that might help explain their involvement in criminal activity or antisocial activities. And, similarly, you have to consider other things besides just personal problems, etc. They might have substance abuse problems, which really causes an issue. There might be mental illness or, serious mental illness, psychological distress, depression. All of these things kind of play a role in this diagnosis area. And then next we have treatment supervision. So after the diagnosis has been made, the probationary staff or the probation staff is asked to supervise the treatment. A program of, let's say, therapy, etc., designed to help the client deal with those problems that we talked about that resulted in his or her antisocial behavior in the first place. So these are all things that probation officers do. And then finally, we have risk classification. And this one really, while the others are important, this one is probably the most important. So as a part of a client's entry into probation, an assessment is made about the risk level that this person poses to the community and themselves. And based on the assessments, offenders are assigned to specific levels. And, there are numbers of assessment instruments that are used. Evaluations of instruments show that when they are used properly, they can be highly valid. And the neighborhood where probationers reside must also be considered, in their individual risk classification. So there's a lot of things when it comes to this risk classification. Kind of just maybe give you a little bit more of a background here. Probationers, again, they receive this risk classification that assigns them to what I talked about, the level and type of supervision, because it might be a higher level supervision on the basis of their particular needs and the risks that they basically, might present to the community. And so some clients might receive frequent, intensive supervision in which they're contacted by their supervising probation officer almost every day, whereas other minor offenders are assigned to basically minimum monitoring. And a number of risk assessment classification approaches, as I said, are used, but most use the kind of the objective measures as the offender's age, their employment status, drug abuse history, prior felony convictions, and the number of address changes in that year before their sentence. So that's kind of how they look at their classification. And it talks about it a little bit more here, but I wanted, before we talked about some of the legal rights, I wanted to talk quickly about monitoring probationers with technology. And there's a little bit of this information that you can find in your textbook, but it is important that, we look at how probationers are actually monitored. And, are some of these better systems, let's say, than maybe some of the other ones? So that really is kind of the reason that I wanted to go over it. So we'll talk a little bit about technology. And we know it's being used, right, to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of probation supervision. So we have electronic reporting, sleep pattern analysis, what they call infrared or infrared spectroscopy, spectroscopy. I'll say that right. That's a tough word. And then GPS monitoring. All right. So when we talk about electronic reporting to improve efficiency, probation departments are now allowing clients to report in without appearing personally. So, I mean, that's good and bad, right? Is that something that, really is, do you think it's a good thing or maybe a bad thing? And New York City, is employing kind of a kiosk system that allows low-risk offenders to report electronically using basically hand biometrics as identification instead of meeting with the officer assigned. And this innovation, if you will, helps probation officers focus their attention on the more high-risk offenders. There's the sleep pattern analysis. And this technology, already in use by some jurisdictions, can provide preliminary indications of substance abuse and help community corrections officials determine whether more testing is warranted. Sleep disruption due to substance abuse can occur in several ways, including altering the sequence and duration of various stages of sleep, total sleep time, and the amount of time needed to fall asleep. And, technology consists of a small device secured to an offender's wrist with a tamper-proof, basically, band that measures the sleep quality by recording motor activity, right? And then they can analyze the data to see if they're, up all night or what have you. So this is kind of an interesting thing. They have what I called the infrared or infrared spectroscopy. And this technology seeks to modify a glucose monitoring device into a alcohol testing product. And the device here uses a light source, an optical detector, and spectrometer to conduct chemical analysis of tissue and measure alcohol levels. So that's kind of cool, right? Results available, are within like 1 minute, and they have the accuracy comparable to a breathalyzer and a blood test. So you can, if you need to test someone for alcohol, etc., you could use that. But the big one is the one here on the screen, GPS monitoring. And, this is where you manage offenders within the community, and you kind of know what they're doing at all times. A number of correctional agencies around the country utilize GPS-based monitoring systems that incorporate a GIS or a geographical information system, a map, if you will, to analyze patterns of movement of offenders. And some of these programs are designed to let probation officers better assess where an offender is at, identify patterns that lead to problem behavior as it unfolds, and improve corrections-based, GPS monitoring systems. So knowing an offender's movement patterns can also help assess treatment issues and make some decisions about early intervention. So really, GPS, kind of in a nutshell, is it basically shows an offender's location and patterns of movement. So if they are involved in criminal activity, you can go back and you can find out where they were at and what time they were there. And you don't have to be constantly following these high-risk individuals around. So, monetarily, it's it's okay, right? I mean, but there are some drawbacks to that as well. All right, so just quickly, we're going to talk about some rights as it relates to probation. And we're not going to go through a whole bunch of them, but what are the legal rights of probationers? I mean, do they have any? And how has the U.S. Supreme Court set limits on the probation process? So, a number of important legal issues surround probation. One set involving civil rights of probationers, and another involving the rights of probationers during the revocation process, right? So, we're right about the 40-minute mark. So, maybe this might be a good time for us to stop. We'll take our first little break and then we'll come back. So, this will end part 1 of chapter 12.